Evan, thanks so much for joining me and taking time to do this.
Yeah, of course. Pleasure to chat.
What sparked your interest in reporting on MCS, environmental illness?
So, if you go further back into my published writing, I really mainly got my start in journalism covering communications infrastructure. And so, this was during COVID when the 5G rollout was happening. Just because I covered this kind of infrastructure, I started seeing on social media a lot of posts of people drawing a connection between the 5G rollout and COVID, and people suspecting or claiming that perhaps uh, COVID 19 was being caused by 5G transceivers. It struck me just on its face as absurd because, like, it has just always sort of been common sense to me that, oh, this stuff is just completely harmless. It's everywhere. So I started researching the issue and I came to learn about EHS and the far deeper history that it has. And I became interested in people who had been displaced by or who had their lives dramatically altered by health effects associated with wireless communications technology. And so when I set out to report what evolved into this Harper's piece, I was looking at a looser spectrum of people with environmental sensitivities, which includes people with EHS, MCS, in many cases, both.
Can you talk a little bit about this particular piece for Harper's on Gary Duncan?
So I found Gary in, I believe, the spring of 2021, and he was one of the people that I had made plans to meet up with.
And where does Gary live?
So Gary winters in a propane heated trailer outside of Moab in Utah. Yeah, so this is in the Southwest. So it's very low population density. It's high elevation. It's a relatively dry and sparsely populated climate. Then he spends the nicer parts of the year traveling around a number of locations that he has identified as being safe in Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico, mostly staying kind of north in that area. During that period of the year where he's traveling, he has a wooden cabin that's built into the back of an old pickup. It's sort of like a mobile shack that goes with him wherever he travels to. And he's made all kinds of custom accommodations to it. There's this adobe mud mixture packed on the exterior. He has a wooden steering wheel. He's redone all the electrical work in the car. The only long-term sustainable solution for him was to take up this kind of transient lifestyle and stay on the move.
What is it that drew you to want to profile Gary specifically? And can you talk a little bit more about his health?
Gary Duncan is 78 now, and he first came to identify with the EHS label in the mid 90s amidst sort of a broader turn in his life. There was a lot of, I think, emotional and spiritual dysfunction in his life. He was a high-end cabinet maker living in LA. He was an alcoholic. He was dealing with a number of different issues, and he sort of went through this period of just radical change. He got into AA, he got sober, he started getting more into spiritual practices, and came into contact with a German doctor who suggested that a lot of his symptoms seemed to align with symptoms of EHS. And he started researching it, found that he felt that it could explain a great many things in his life that he had been dealing with.
And you mentioned Gary lives with EHS. And what do you know about his MCS?
So Gary claims a broad range of sensitivities. He is particularly passionate about the EHS thing because I think that is especially difficult to get away from and is perhaps taken less seriously by a lot of medical doctors and just people in mainstream society more broadly. But yeah, as far as MCS, he feels sensitive to a lot of common chemical products.
Yeah. And so how much time did you spend with him and what were your impressions?
I spent, I think it was 3 days the first time I met up with him, maybe 4 days the second time. Gary is just like a really compelling character. I think is he has very strong beliefs. He is a pretty strong and forceful personality. He's a bit eccentric. I think he's a very sincere, gregarious person who goes out of his way to be helpful. And I think the extent to which he does this can sometimes be a bit surprising. It's like, oh, wow, this guy has chosen to live this extremely secluded, kind of isolated lifestyle. But as soon as he's in contact with people, he's like all smiles and just wants to talk. He's a really sweet, sincere, genuine guy. And I chose to build the piece around him mainly because I just thought he was a compelling character.
Yeah, and there are, as you know, a lot of folks who just can't live anywhere, so they do seek this isolated lifestyle in remote areas. That's like Gary, right? He just needs to be out there.
Yeah, absolutely. But there are lots of people who identify with these labels as well, who are living in cities, living in normal urban areas, and either just dealing with the symptoms or doing what they can to manage them. And I think that's probably a far larger population. Because I spoke to a number of advocates, and they maybe felt that for me to focus on someone like Gary Duncan, who's in this kind of extreme situation, paints EHS and MCS in a particular light that is perhaps at risk of just reinforcing a public perception of, oh, these people are, this is psychosomatic, these people are unstable, they're like not quote unquote normal in so many other ways.
What were your thoughts going into this about writing a profile for a very influential publication? So every time there's a piece about MCS, it can influence public thinking. And so were you thinking about that, like in terms of your decision of choosing someone who's, you mentioned that was your word, eccentric, right? The choice to interview someone who is eccentric risks exoticizing the illness. And so what are your thoughts on that?
I have experienced so much self doubt around this. I've had moments working on that piece where I'm just like, what am I doing? This feels irresponsible. So I've gone through cycles of self doubt and acceptance around it. This is maybe not a very satisfying answer, but it's just at the end of the day, doing a profile of, oh, people in my neighborhood living everyday lives. It's not as easy to build like a forceful like narrative around it. So in one sense, that is a real consideration. I mean, especially after I started reporting this story, I would tell friends and associates that I was working on it, that I was thinking about this issue, I was talking to people, and just the fact that became a common conversation starter in my life led me to recognize, oh, there are so many people who identify with chemical sensitivities who I just wouldn't have known that otherwise. Really, just minor everyday things. Like my day job, I drive a school bus. I have a coworker who is allowed to, she is only ever put in our propane powered buses because she experiences negative effects from the diesel exhaust on the diesel buses. I do feel a lot of empathy for Gary and people like Gary. And I don't think that someone in his situation needs to be seen as crazy or whatever, because at the end of the day, although his character profile may not represent or resonate with the majority of people with MCS, it is similar to a lived experience that a lot of people do have today.
There's an argument that some researchers put forward that it is a psychological disorder, right? That it's anxiety based, and then there are others that credible research that shows it's not, and it's a physiological illness. But the challenge is that there aren't biomarkers, right? So I can't go to the doctor and get a blood test or a brain scan and show that I'm reacting to whatever makes me ill. Just for the record, I'm of the firm belief that it's not a psychological disorder. And I wonder, as someone who's looking in at this illness from the outside, how you think that could function. What would it look like? If we take me as an example, like my kryptonite is dryer sheets are one of the big ones. So if I have my window open here and I'm in my home and dryer sheet fumes blow in, it's going to make me very ill, and the symptoms will be multiple and they'll last for many days. What does that what could that mean? Let's just say if I have a psychological illness, what's happening there? Is it that I'm just having a stress response, or I'm having an anxiety attack? Because my reaction isn't anxiety based. So what do you think
No,
could be going on in a person's mind and person? What do you think would be happening there?
I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I think that you are having a psychosomatic anxiety based stress response. I feel in no way equipped to tell that to another person. What I can speak to is my own personal experience with this stuff, which is, and I get into this in the Harper's piece. When I first started reporting this piece, frankly, there was a lot of spiritual and emotional imbalance in my life. I have since been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I had really bad substance use issues. I was badly abusing amphetamines. So, this is part of why the article took so long. I actually had a draft done like 1 year after I had started reporting in like the summer of 2022. And around that time, I experienced a full blown psychotic break that escalated to a point. It didn't start here, but it got to a point where I believed that I was experiencing premonitions and receiving direct instructions from a higher power. I mean, just totally out there, delusional, magical thinking. And my behavior became very erratic. This whole episode destabilized my life in a lot of ways that I'm still dealing with. But one of the things that happened during that time was I started subjectively experiencing really powerful EHS reactions. And this actually started in a much milder place after I had gotten back from being with Gary Duncan, because I was just spending a lot of time thinking about these conditions and like, what is it like for people who experience them? And so I sort of started doing tests on myself. Like I would put my head right next to a Wi-Fi router, for example, and hold it there for a little while. And I started feeling as though like, oh, when I get close to these, I notice that like I can feel this sort of like rippling, staticky sort of, felt completely like a physical bodily response to proximity to like the 5G transceiver that can then lead to a headache or whatever. So first I was experiencing that, and that sort of built up towards, I had this larger kind of like fully delusional psychotic break that has took me a long time to recover from. And coming out of that experience, I have no idea how to draw lines around like what was real about this. I think that your mind really can work your body up into having a sort of like bodily response, and that can feel entirely real and it can be very debilitating. But I personally don't want to universalize that experience and say that, oh, yeah, Aaron, that's what you're going through right now.
Yeah,
I
I hear
don't
you.
believe that. I wouldn't make that stretch. I do think that can be a real thing. And
And what do you think of the role of a journalist and the media in, navigating these issues and creating public information, public knowledge? Do you feel like you had a lot of responsibility on your shoulders going into this?
I think that I may have had more responsibility than I initially understood when I was first approaching the project. Personally, again, I don't like to make generalizations about what I think other people should be doing, but in my own work, I try to approach issues from a place of empathy and in trying to foster empathy in others. And that does not always mean that a source is going to be completely happy with my article or that they're going to feel perfectly represented. But my goal is to try to communicate to readers in a way that will help them perhaps better understand people or an issue that maybe they hadn't considered super deeply before.
How has Gary responded to the piece?
So I actually have not heard from Gary since the piece came out. And this is something that I have been having some anxiety about because I had been in touch with him in the months leading up to its publication, and I know that he was kind of anxious about it coming out. And so when I'm talking about people feeling misrepresented by it, I think the one of the biggest anxieties or concerns I have is that Gary may have felt exploited or taken advantage of. So I don't know what he's thinking about it right now, actually. I think that he may have hoped that my piece was going to be more of like an expose or like a really clear cut takedown of the telecom industry or something, and not so much focused on like him as a person. So yeah, I haven't heard from him, and I would be curious to know how he felt about it, however he felt about it. But yeah.
Do you think it's getting harder for folks like Gary, and you mentioned there are probably hundreds, if not thousands of others who are environmental refugees with MCS? Do you think it's getting harder for folks to find places that are safe for them?
Absolutely. It is undeniable that people who use these labels to self-identify are suffering in many cases, and it's very hard. Snowflake, which I visited in my piece, Snowflake, Arizona, is one of the largest sort of permanently settled EHS and MCS communities in the United States. Right now, in real time, there is a proposed cell tower that is planned to be built 2 miles away from their community. And I think that whatever one may think about their condition, for me, it's hard to see why should they not have a place that feels safe for them to live. Why should they not be able to make their own health decisions and have bodily autonomy in that way?
Did Gary talk a little bit about, or at all about, any stigma he's faced, any judgment that people have had for him, towards him?
Gary is an example of someone who I think has come around to a place of like, he accepts that a lot of people see him as crazy, and he doesn't care about that anymore. He's just sort of like, okay, you can think that about me. I'm going to think the same about you. Like, you can be in denial about these things if you want to, whatever. I mean, that's part of why I was able to get so much access from him, was because he sort of had this attitude of like, I have no control over what you're going to do with this information. I'm going to put it out there, and however things land is just how it's supposed to happen. Now, from having talked to many other people with EHS and MCS, I understand that a very common issue is this sort of experience of not being taken seriously, of having one's conditions written off, particularly by family members, coworkers, people that the person may be close to. And I don't know what to say about that, except that I completely understand how maddeningly frustrating that experience could be.
It's crushing when it
Yeah.
happens. Yeah, it's very hurtful when it happens. Yeah. I talked to a psychiatrist about, whether MCS is a psychiatric illness, and her view is that it's not. It's clearly not.
Mm.
But, having to live with a condition where, people who have it don't know from one second to the next, whether they will be able to be healthy or not. That in itself can create a lot of anxiety. And I can imagine having to isolate oneself and move. And I imagine there must be financial pressures, and there's social pressures, and there's stigma, right? And just being isolated. You mentioned being isolated from people for that many years, right? All of those stressors could, I imagine, create what could appear as psychological disorder.
Absolutely. And everyone struggles with mental health issues. Like I struggle with mental health issues. I aside from all the other stuff I talked about earlier, like I experience stress, I experience depression. There are days when I don't want to get out of bed. There are days when it's very difficult for me to perform basic functioning tasks. And I can totally understand how like someone with one of these labels that are considered contentious, controversial, not taken seriously by many of those in the medical profession, how like all of these sort of like very normal things that just we as human beings deal with could get put under a microscope, and seen as, oh, is this like further evidence of your instability? Or how I can totally see how those things can become weaponized. I absolutely believe that happens all the time. I completely understand how the way in which they can be perceived by some people can just become immensely frustrating in ways
Yeah.
that many other people do not have to deal with.
I think it's actually impossible for people to understand. We don't get it until we get it. I remember my mom when she developed cancer over 10 years ago and died from cancer. She said, "Oh, this is what cancer feels like." I was like, "How does cancer feel like, Mom?" Because we don't get it until we get it.
Right.
Will you continue to report on this issue of environmental health and MCS?
That is difficult for me to say. I've kind of just wrapped this project up, and right now it's something that I'm not really chomping at the bit to keep digging back into, just because there are so many points of sensitivity that I had not considered at the outset. There's so many things that I don't understand very well and that I don't feel qualified to comment on in a very authoritative way, that if I do continue to report on it, it will be in an iteratively even more thought out and deliberate kind of way. I'm not sure if I'm going to embark on anything substantial in the future, but if I do, I would want to continue to learn from my mistakes and be careful about it.
Well, I appreciate your humility and your willingness to talk with me and your openness and for all the work that you've done on this. So, Evan, thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Aaron. It's been a pleasure.